I came across this article through the Blind Injustice Facebook page. Mark Hodinett in particular talks a lot about the prison culture in America. You know, they sort of lock him up and throw away the key. When you're looking at wrongful convictions, you can't help but notice the way that things work in America, even for those that are guilty of crimes. But you just wonder about why lock so many people up. You know, it does seem bizarre. If it's meant to work as a deterrent, quite simply, like the death penalty, it's not working. If carrying guns to protect yourself is meant to be a deterrent, clearly that's not working either. On average, 100 people killed every day through violence across the pond there. So anyway, we've got a couple of articles that I wanted to share with you. This is one that I actually sent to Mark straight away, because it is pretty bizarre. Let's pop that one up, share that. Move me out of the way. That. So as I say, this was an article that was featured in the Facebook page Blind Injustice, which of course is Mark Gods's Facebook page to do with his great book. Anyway, this is an article by Lauren Brooke Eason, and the federal funding that fuels mass incarceration. Decades of financial incentives by the federal government have encouraged states and cities to put more people behind bars for longer, with devastating results. This essay is part of the Brennan Center's series examining the punitive excess that has come to define America's criminal legal system. And I like the fact that they don't use the word justice, it's the criminal legal system. Justice doesn't really have anything to do with it. As it says here, other essays in this series have pointed out how sentencing laws and other criminal legal policies have created a system of mass incarceration, resulting in more than 2.1 million people behind bars, almost 4.5 million people on probation and parole, and 70 million people with criminal convictions. What is far less well known is how federal funding for law enforcement and prison construction has played a key role in creating today's vast national carceral landscape. For more than half a century, federal dollars have incentivized and rewarded disproportionately punitive responses to crime. Since the late 1960s, federal funding has fueled local criminal justice policy in ways that have resulted in more arrests, more incarceration or probation, harsher sentencing laws, and more contacts with the criminal justice legal apparatus. Today, Washington spends billions of dollars each year subsidizing state and local criminal justice agencies. The Justice Department by itself distributes more than $5 billion in federal grants to state and local governments annually, not including the funding that law enforcement agencies across the nation get from the Department of Homeland Security. Hundreds of millions more come through the Department of Defense, which facilitates the transfer of military-grade weapons and armored vehicles to police departments. For instance, a $705,000 armored mine-resistant vehicle for Bridgeport, Connecticut. Even the Department of Agriculture has gotten involved, providing $360 million to build jails in rural communities since 1996. Now, I'm just going to go back. I'm just going to stop this a moment. I'm just going to share something else with you, because some of you will remember that Manitowoc Sheriff's Department under Robert Herman. They received a tactical assault vehicle. And here's the, not that article. I couldn't find that one for some reason, but I did find this one. Wisconsin agencies have 28 million in surplus military gear. Wisconsin police agencies have acquired more than $28 million worth of military gear from the Pentagon during the past decade, including mine-resistant trucks, night vision goggles, assault rifles, grenade launchers, and a helicopter. Let's just have a look at that. That's your military assault vehicle. That is exactly like the one that Robert Herman ordered for the Sheriff's Department. The Manitowoc Sheriff's Department for a rural community. Bizarre, isn't it? Records from the State's Department of Military Affairs obtained by Gannett, Wisconsin Media, of which obviously the Post-Crescent is one, under Wisconsin's public record laws, show that more than 67,000 military-grade items were given to 219 agencies since 2004. The program, known as 1033, was authorized in 1990 as part of the nation's war on drugs. Another piece of legislation approved in 1997 broadened its use, and equipment transfers escalated again after the September 11 attacks due to counter-terrorism efforts nationwide. Local police pay for maintenance and transportation of the gear, which still is owned by the federal government. President Barack Obama called this week for a sharp separation between the armed forces and police departments following a forceful police response to the unrest in Ferguson. That's Missouri, isn't it? And of course, that's interesting because that was the case that that a lot of people say has led to the wrongful conviction of Daniel Holtzclaw. Obama also said it may be time for a review of the transfers that have ballooned to a reported $5 billion since 1997. Well, we've just read that other article that starts off by saying that there has been $5 billion. In Wisconsin, a large number of law enforcement agencies, both large and small, continue to take advantage of the 1033 transfers. Oh, there you go. The Brown County Sheriff's Department acquired a mine-resistant, ambush-protected military surplus vehicle in April. Officials say it's a tool they can use when encountering extreme public safety situations, such as standoff involving high-caliber weapons. In Brown County, the Sheriff's Department received a massive mine-resistant, ambush-protected military surplus vehicle in April. It only had to pay $3,900 to have the vehicle, valued at about $700,000, correct? Yeah, shipped from Texas, said Lieutenant Dan Sandberg, commander of the Brown County Sheriff's official SWAT team. He noted a December incident in Fond du Lac, where a heavily armored man opened fire on police with a small arsenal of weapons, including a .50 caliber sniper rifle that would have penetrated most unarmed police squads. That's the only kind of vehicle that will protect you from something like that, Sandberg said about the mine-resistant vehicle. People now have .50 caliber rifles, and we have to be prepared for something like that. I hope this MRAP sits in the garage for nothing more than training. I hope we never have to pull it out. Well, I would agree with you there, Mr. Sandberg. Okay, let's just get back then to that other article that we were looking at. There we go. So come down here. Let's click on share screen and let's put that one back up. I think this is where we got to. Yes. The history of such punitive funding stretches back to President Lyndon Johnson's signing of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which earmarked $400 million for law enforcement purposes. 4 years later, Richard Nixon, who had ascended to the presidency after running a campaign focused on law and order, announced that since 1969, his administration had doled out 1.5 billion in state and local law enforcement grants, compared to just 22 million during the final 3 years of the Johnson administration. In the ensuing years, as crime increased, particularly crime related to the spread of crack cocaine, so did the flow of federal dollars. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, signed by President Ronald Reagan, increased funding for law enforcement and mandated harsher penalties in federal drug cases, including life imprisonment. The legislation not only dedicated more than 1.1 billion to state and federal law enforcement agencies, including an authorization of 96.5 million for new federal prisons, but also expanded the use of no-knock warrants, such as the one used by Louisville police last year when they killed Breonna Taylor as she slept in her home. Then came the legislation that showed how policy had been fully separated from reality. Crime in the United States peaked in 1991, but even as it declined, Washington's appetite for crueler penalties and overreaching enforcement increased. The watershed moment was the enactment of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, often referred to as the 1994 Crime Bill, signed into law by President Bill Clinton. By the time of the bill's enactment, the violent crime rate had already fallen by 6%. By the time it took effect the following year, violent crime was down by 10%. Yet over the next decade, despite what would become the most dramatic drop in crime in the nation's history, politicians chose not to lead the nation in urgently necessary conversations about the proper role of enforcement and punishment, but to feed the punitive machine they had built. The 1994 Crime Bill did ban 19 types of semi-automatic firearms defined as assault weapons, as well as restricting the characteristics of firearms that could be sold legally. And it included the Violence Against Women Act to protect victims of domestic violence. However, the legislation also mandated harsher penalties for people caught in the criminal legal system. It authorized the death penalty for dozens of existing and newly defined federal crimes, and it required life imprisonment for any conviction for a third violent felony, the infamous 3 strikes and you're out policy. It also established a funding mechanism that incentivized and rewarded states for sending people to prison for very long periods of time. The 1994 Crime Bill also offered federal grants to states to expand their prison capacity, and it made the grants dependent on states increasing the length of incarceration of those convicted of violent crimes. Through the bill's violent offender incarceration and truth in sentencing incentive grants program, the legislation authorized 12.5 billion in grants to fund incarceration, with nearly 50% earmarked for states that adopted tough truth in sentencing laws that scaled back parole. Specifically, states were rewarded for having or enacting laws requiring those convicted of violent crimes to serve at least 85% of the sentence imposed, making it difficult for those convicted of violent crimes to earn early release based on rehabilitative principles. 11 states adopted TIS, truth in sentencing laws, in 1995, 1 year after the bill was signed. By 1998, incentive grants had been awarded to 27 states and the District of Columbia. In addition to the financial incentives, states found significant symbolic value in the program's messaging. In 1999, the authors of an Urban Institute study on the legislation's impact interviewed a staff member of Connecticut's Office of Policy and Management. They wrote, when asked about Connecticut's motivation in moving to an 85% truth in sentencing law, the staff member responded that Connecticut liked to be ahead of the curve on national reforms, and she implied that the state government might be viewed negatively if it did not seek federal funds to help with its perceived crime problem. Another creation of the 1994 Crime Bill was the community-oriented Policing Services Program, COPS program, a division of the Justice Department that has provided billions of dollars to police departments to hire new officers. Between 1995 and 1999, the annual appropriation for the COPS program averaged nearly 1.4 billion. At the same time, as journalist Radley Balco, we've come across Radley before, haven't we, demonstrated in his 2013 book, Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of Americans' police forces, the federal government ceded some control over the use of this money, resulting in many law enforcement agencies spending funds not on community policing, but on the militarization of their forces. Yeah, I've read the Cadaver King and the Country Dentist by Radley Belko and Tucker Carrington, and a very good book it was too, featuring, of course, supposed Dr. Michael West and Stephen Haynes, I think it was. Anyway, let's carry on. And so it continued. Even as the frequency of crime declined, the federal response was more spending on more enforcement and more punishment. In 2005, when reauthorizing the Violence Against Women's Act, Congress expanded previous laws providing funding for local police to create the Justice Assistance Grant, the JAG program. All 50 states plus Washington, DC, 6 US territories, and more than 1,000 local governments now utilize JAG funds, which amount to 300 to 500 million yearly, dollars that support almost any criminal justice activity covered by the federal statute. For many years, civil rights groups criticized the program for funding drug task forces that were often unnecessary for the protection of public safety. These task forces provide avenues for agencies across governments to share personnel, equipment, intelligence, and other resources. Critics, including the Brennan Center, pointed out that federal officials asked JAG recipients to report the number of arrests made, but not their crime rates. DOJ also measured the amount of cocaine seized, but not whether those arrested were screened for drug addiction. The department's own metrics sent a signal to states and local governments that JAG funding was implicitly conditioned on more arrests, more cocaine busts, and more prosecutions, inevitably at the expense of crime prevention activities or programs that could divert people from the criminal legal system. Today, there is an emerging recognition that federal dollars have helped deepen today's devastating fissures between police and the communities they purport to serve, perpetuating trauma and harm through mass incarceration and criminal legal system overreach. Under the Obama administration, the Justice Department revised JAG performance measures to better steer recipients towards the development of programs that would reduce crime and incarceration in place of increased enforcement and arrest activity. For example, the Department of Justice stopped asking how many people were arrested and how many drugs were seized, and instead started asking about the number of citations issued in lieu of arrest and whether prosecutors routinely recommend alternatives to prison. The ripple effects from mass incarceration are causing generations of damage. So many children, more than 5.3 million under age 18, by a recent estimate, have experienced parental incarceration that in 2013 Sesame Street felt it have experienced parental incarceration so that in 2013 Sesame Street felt it necessary to add a Muppet named Alex, whose father is incarcerated, to reach out to children grappling with how to grow up with a parent behind bars. Wow, I was always a fan of the Muppets, not the ones involved in the legal system in Wisconsin. No, I'm not a big fan of them. In a 2015 speech before the NAACP, Bill Clinton publicly apologized for the harm the 1994 crime bill caused. "I signed a bill that made the problem worse, and I want to admit it," he said. In that bill, there were longer sentences, and most of these people were in prison under state law, but the federal law set a trend, and that was overdone. We were wrong about that. In what was a remarkable and rare acknowledgement of how far afield policymakers and government strayed by overfunding the growth of our police and carceral state, one can catch a glimpse of the regret of a nation. So that's a very interesting article there. Let's give the lady that wrote it the credit for writing it, Lauren Brooke Eason of the Brennan Center for Justice. Okay, interesting article. As I say, Mark in particular has always gone on about, and a lot of other people, this incarceration rate. The more people you incarcerate as well, even the government themselves admit that probably between 5 and 10% have been wrongfully convicted. Between 5 and 10% of 2 million is between, well, if it's 5%, that would be 100,000. 10% is obviously 200,000 or 210,000, isn't it? It's 2.1 million people locked up, which is a huge number. Anyway, as I say, later this evening, 7 o'clock my time, looking forward to doing a live chat with supporters of Daniel and some information, or a trend, shall we say, within the Wisconsin Court of Appeals. So we'll catch you all soon. Take care. Bye for now.